All right, Jeff, we'll say good morning, everyone. Let us begin. So as I put out on the chat last night, we're going to begin with the daf in Meretz Hashem this morning. A little bit of a longer daf today. So if we have some time at the end, we'll come back. I also, again, as of already this week in Meretz Hashem, we're going to go back to Tzidkas HaTzadik in the morning. And Mishnah Yomi is posted. Today's Mishnah Yomi is already on the chat. So if you're not yet on the Mishnah Yomi WhatsApp group, I'll post the link on the Daf Yomi group as well. You could join, or everything's posted on the website and the podcast as well. But in Meretz Hashem, we're still going to continue in Mishnah Yomi, but we'll go back to our Tzaddik, his Orus in Meretz Hashem in the morning as well. But today, we'll begin with the Daf, a little bit of a longer Daf today, a beautiful Daf, but to ensure that we get through the entire Daf, we'll start now. So we'll say, begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's share, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, to thank Bracha Strimber for dedicating all the Shir and Drashos this month in loving memory of her husband, Avi Strimber, Avraham ben Kalman, Eliezer Halevi, Zichrona Lebrach. We hope that the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah, and the family in Nechama. We thank Avi Tobias for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drashos this month in appreciation of the Shir and appreciation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the incredible Torah He has given us. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Barry and Rina Dubin, for dedicating the learning this week in the Schus of Refuah Shalema for Chava Tzipora Bas Chaya Malka. She should have a refuah together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. But with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Yud Beis, and we are picking up Mamish, the top of Yud Beis, very top line. Says the Gemara, Amar Shmuel, Mekabli Kiboles, B'socha Tchum Aser, Chutz L'Tchum Muter. So I say, interestingly enough, still talking about the halachas of Chalamayid, but transitioning a little bit to a different kind of halacha. Actually, this is fascinating because this is the topic that we were doing in Smichas Chaver, that we just actually finished last week, the halachos of Amira L'Nochri, namely instructing a non-Jew to do malacha for you on Shabbos. See here, the Gemara discussed the following case. Shmuel says, Makabli Kiboles. Now, again, in halacha, there are different ways that you can go ahead and contract with a worker. So a person could be a schir yom, a day laborer, like we discussed, or a person could be a kablan. Kablan will loosely translate as a contractor. Now, what's the idea of a kablan? Kablan is you give the person, it's their job. It's their job. In halacha, interesting enough, it's viewed as if they're working for themselves. Now, the truth is, of course, when I hire someone as a kablan, they're working for me. I'm paying them, doing a job for me, but because they have autonomy over that job, how that job is done, when the job is done, when it's accomplished, at the end of the day, they are considered to be autonomous. So therefore, Shmuel says as follows. So, Mekabli Kiboles, if I go ahead and I contract with a non-Jew, I give him as a contractor, if he's working on my job within the tchum, right, within the 2,000 amos, the tchum Shabbos, ultimately aser. Chutz l'tchum, outside of the tchum, it's mutter. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over here, Mekabli kiboles b'socha tchum aser, litin malacha l'nachri b'kiboles, ki avile b'shabsa, diyode kuli alma, Vamri Hayom Shabbos Yohevlei. V'Shabbat say, listen to this. So Shmuel says as follows. Shmuel says, by the way, we're talking here about Shabbos, not Chalamayid. Although again, as we're going to see many of the halachos that we're going to highlight by Shabbos, we will apply afterwards to Chalamayid as well. So Shmuel says like this: if I have contracted with a non-Jew to do work, so is he allowed to continue with that work over Shabbos? So the Gemara says, Shmuel says it depends. If the work is happening inside of the tchum, which means essentially inside of Jewish habitation, you can't have the work go on. Why? Because people will assume that the non-Jew is operating on my behalf, and that is going to be usher. Outside of the tchum, people don't really know what it is that's going on, so it's not a problem. So the Gemara says, finish that Rashi, Bahad the Shari Beis Hillel Paris. Actually, we don't have to finish that Rashi. Good. Amar Papa, va'afilu chut l'tchum. Papa says, furthermore, even outside of the tchum, lo amran ela deleka masa demakar v'lahasam. It's only true if the non-Jew is operating far away, where there is no other community, there is no other city that's close by. Aval ika masa de mekarva lahasam. But if there is another city that is close to the area in which the non-Jew is operating, aser, then it's aser as well. Good. So I will say that's the halacha of Shmuel. A fascinating halacha. Again, I will say, we literally just finished this in Smichas Chaver about the concept of going ahead and having a non-Jew operate as a kablon. So Shmuel gives his halacha that again, if the non-Jew is operating as a kablon, chutz l'tchum, it's mutter, b'socha tchum, it's aser. But even chutz l'tchum, that's only assuming that it's not bordering another Jewish city. But if it's next to another Jewish city, the non-Jew can't operate on my behalf as well on Shabbos. So we'll say the concern being that even though halachically I'm good, because since the non-Jew is a kablon, anything he's doing on Shabbos is what we call adaita dinafshe. He's working for himself. But really what's happening over here is a maris ayin issue. So the Gemara goes weiter, Amra Misharshia, v'chileka masa de mekarva lahasam, nami lo amran, ella Bishabasos v'yamim tovim delo shrichi inshi. So we'll say Rav Misharshia comes along and he qualifies Shmuel's ruling a little bit more. When did Shmuel say that halacha l'maisa, if the non-Jew, so we'll say there's a lot of criteria over here. Number one, the non-Jew is a kablan. Number two, he's operating outside of the tchum. Number three, there's no other Jewish city that's close to where the non-Jew is operating. If those three criteria are met, the non-Jew could do his thing on Shabbos. But when is that true? Rabbi Sharshia says, Dafka, Shabbos, and Yom Tiv. Delo shchichi in shida azli lahasam. Because we both say, in Shabbos and Yom Tiv, people aren't traveling around. Ava b'cholol shamoed. Now it loops back to our sugya. But on Chalamoed, Tishchichi in shida azli va'asula hasam. But saying Chalamoed, everybody's doing Chalamoed trips, right? Everybody's out and about. San Chalamoed, where people will go ahead and travel a bit further, then we are concerned. So even in that, so both saying in Chalamoed, ultimately again, even if the criteria are met, it'll still be asr. So now, as we both say, here's what's fascinating: two separate halachas. So on Shabbos and Yom Tiv, Rabbi Misharshia's view of Shmuel is that as long as A, the non-Jew is a kablon, B, the work is taking place outside of the tchum, C, there's no other Jewish city close to where the non-Jew is operating, you're good to go. The non-Jew could do his thing on Shabbos because he's not working for me, he's working for himself. But again, says Rabbi Misharshia on Chalamoed, even if you meet those three criteria, it's still asr. It's still asr because since on Chalamoed people are out and about, we're concerned Jews are going to come and see this non-Jew working on my behalf. And again, Abbas, remember again, when Jews see a non-Jew working on my behalf, they have no idea that he's a kablon. They just automatically assume that what? That I have contracted him to do this work on Chalamoed, which of course is asr. Therefore, again, al tzmaris ayin, right? The process will be prohibited. So the Gemara tells the story. Mar Zutra berei de Rav Nachman banu le apadno mikable kiboles chutz l'tchum. So the Gemara tells the story. Mar Zutra was right. Mar Zutra, son of Rav Nachman, was building for himself a mansion. Baruch Hashem, he was building for himself a mansion, and he was doing it outside of the tchum. Right, summer home, right? He was building a home outside of the tchum mansion. And again, obviously, as one would imagine, with most homes that are being built, halacha l'maisa, it was a situation of a kablonos. So he hired a kabla and he hired a contractor to build himself a mansion outside. And then what happens? Mar Zutra decides to go ahead and invite over company. And Rav Safra and Rav Huna Bar Chinina, so he invites over Rav Safra and Rav Huna Bar Chinina, v'lo alu l'gabei. They would not enter the mansion. They would not enter the mansion. V'gadamri. So I'll say, so they would not enter the mansion. Why? Because apparently they felt that it was built be'isr. Right? It was built be'isr. They felt that Mar Zutra did not build this appropriately. Therefore, they would not benefit from it. Ikadamri, an alternate version of this, hunami lo begave. No, it wasn't just these other rabbanim. Mar Zutra himself, after the fact, would not use the mansion. The Gemara said, but 1 second. V'ha amar Shmuel mekabli kibulas b'socha tchum asar chutz l'tchum mutar. But 1 second, Mar Zutra seemed to have done everything correctly. This was, remember again, a project built by a kablon outside of the tchum. So what's the problem? So I will say this is going to be a recurring theme during today's daf, The Gemara says, Adam chashuv shiny. This we already introduced to this concept in yesterday's daf, that perhaps an Adam chashuv, right, a person who is well known and highly respected, highly regarded, is different, and such an individual may be required to hold himself to a different standard. We'll say the idea being that in general there's a concept of marasayin, right? And what's the concept of marasayin? That I can't go ahead and do something that looks prohibited. There are two reasons for marasayin, right? What are the two reasons? Number one is a concern that if people see me doing something and they don't understand what it is that I'm doing, they may learn from my activities and may think that something that is really prohibited is permitted, even though what I'm doing is permitted. People don't necessarily know the circumstances of what it is that I'm doing. So the concern number one is people may learn from my activities and may end up doing something prohibited. The other possibility, the other idea of marasayin is v'isem nekiyim, that a person is obligated to project an image of piety. I'm supposed to try to be beyond reproach. That's true for all of us. An Adam Chashuv, someone who is quote-unquote a Chashuv person, a highly regarded individual, has to hold himself to even a higher standard. So interestingly enough, what the Gemara seems to be suggesting over here is, Mar Zutra built his home in accordance with halacha. He built his home in accordance with halacha. The problem is, even though it was built in accordance with halacha, there's still a concern that people may not understand the circumstances through which he built this home, utilizing non-Jewish labor, which most probably worked on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So because of that, now again, did he do it in a mutter fashion? Absolutely. But is it quote-unquote beyond reproach? Not necessarily. And as a result of that, Mar Zutra himself did not want to use the mansion. Interesting idea. I will say, so again, we'll see that halacha l'maisa, this Mar Zutra was being machmir. Right, one is not obligated to conduct themselves, but perhaps again the reason for the chumrah of Mar Zutra was because of Adam Chashuv. Dikadamri, others say no. Damri siyu siyai betivna ba'adayu. Others say no. There's actually a different issue over here. That Mar Zutra, this wasn't a typical case of a kablanos. In a typical case of a kablanos, of a contractor, so what happens? The contractor has the job, and he's on his own for the job. In this case, Mar Zutra supplied them with straw. So because he supplied them with straw, again, he was a real shutaf, he was a real partner in the building, and as such, he felt that perhaps after the fact, it would be inappropriate for him to go ahead and benefit from this structure. If you look at Rashi says, Siyue havim misai b'tivna, she'enosi lahem teven l'malacha, da'hoil v'hu misei b'hadayu aser. Okay, Simar gives another example. Rav Chama shari luhu la'abungari debei reish kalusa le'mei aved lu'avedeta b'chol demoed. It was very interesting. Rav Chama allowed the abanguri. What's abanguri? Rashi says misader shulchanos. So it's interesting. I would think that it's just the carpenter, right? The carpenter, but apparently it's a specialized malacha to fix tables. Okay, so Rav Chama allowed the table fixers in the house of the Reish Kalusa to work on Chalamayid. Rashi says, "Leme avad avadetayu in nishpar hashulchan shayletakno." If a table breaks, it's permitted to fix it. So Rav Chama allowed the table fixers in the house of the Reish Kalusa to go into the work on Chalamayid. Amar kevan da'agar, since ultimately again they're hired out. Kevan da'agar lo kashakli sharshuye hudi kamashar shulei v'les lanba. So what says is very interesting. Apparently, the setup that the Reish Kalusa had with these workers over Chalamayid is he didn't pay them a wage. Instead, what he paid them was in food, that they had the ability to partake of all of the su'udos they want. Look at Rashi. Sharshuye, Rashi says, Revach ba'alma kedei su'udasam de ka'achli b'hadayu v'lo ka'chashiv malacha. So it says, interestingly enough, because they're not getting paid a wage, so to speak, and they're getting paid in food, therefore, again, this was a permitted type of arrangement on Chalamayid. Interesting. So, Tarabanan, Mekabli kiboles b'moed la sosa la achar moed u'b'moed aser. So, let's listen to this. Another interesting halacha. So, Mekabli kiboles moed. Well, so you could create a kablanos on Chalamayid for after Chalamayid. In other words, we'll say, I could hire someone. Now Rashi says we're talking about a nochri, a non-Jew. Look at Rashi, mekablin kiboles. Nostin l'nachri la'asos la'achar moed. So we'll say, interestingly enough, you can go ahead and contract someone during Chol Hamoed for work after Chol Hamoed. That's going to be permitted. However, again, the Gemara says, Uba Moed Asr, but you cannot go ahead and contract someone for work on Chol Hamoed itself. Now, remember again, we already saw pretty much we've seen one category so far of malacha that's permitted on Chol Hamoed, and that's davar ha'avad, right? Here we're talking about something totally different. Here we're talking about, this is not davar ha'avad. This is, I want to build something. I want to put on an addition. I want to redo my kitchen. I want to do something to my house. So I want to hire a kablan to do that. So the Gemara says, you could hire the kablan on Chol Hamoed for work after Chol Hamoed, but you cannot hire the kablan on Chol Hamoed to what? To do work on Chol Hamoed. And we'll say, here we go, klalo shel davar. So we'll say this is an incredibly important principle, and this is actually codified in the Shulchan Aruch. Kol davar shehu oseh, omer l'nachri va'oseh. Anything that you can do on Chol Hamoed, you could tell a nachri to do on Chol Hamoed. V'chol she'ino oseh, ino omer l'nachri va'oseh. But anything that you cannot do on Chol Hamoed, you cannot ask a nachri to do on Chol Hamoed. So we'll say, this, by the way, is the halacha, not just on Chol Hamoed, but this is the paradigmatic formulation of halacha by Shabbos as well. So we'll say, again, Hilchos Amira L'Nachri is much more complicated, as I think, how many shurim did we spend on it? 11, 12, right? I think 11 shiurim altogether on Amira L'Nachri. So I will say, so there's a lot of halachas on Amira L'Nachri, but again, on a basic level, the halacha says, anything that you can do, you can ask a non-Jew to do. But if you can't do it, you can't ask a non-Jew to do it. Now, the truth is, there are exceptions to that rule as well, many exceptions to that rule. But as a basic guiding light principle, it's correct. The Gemara now is telling us the same halacha applies to Chol Hamoed as well. Interestingly enough, same halacha applies to Chol Hamoed. So whatever, ultimately, again, you could tell a non-Jew, whatever you could do, you could tell a non-Jew to do. Therefore, I will say, based on this, I can hire the kablan on Chol Hamoed for work after Chol Hamoed, but I can't hire him to fix my kitchen or to build me something on Chol Hamoed itself, unless, of course, we're talking about a davar ha'avad. So Tanya Idach another brayso. So mekablin kibolis b'moilas osla achara moed. You can go ahead and hire a contractor on Chol Hamoed for work to be done after Chol Hamoed. Ubilvad shelo yimdod v'shelo yishkol v'shelo yimne k'derech she'osa b'chol. Now, the Gemara qualifies this. While it is true that you can go ahead and hire a kablan on Chol Hamoed for work after Chol Hamoed, what can't you do? You can't measure, you can't weigh, and you can't count in the way that you would do during the week. Now, we'll say, just to illustrate this, the easy way to illustrate this is as follows. Let's say I'm hiring someone to make me a suit. Now, it was common, at least in times of the Gemara, that if you were hiring someone to make for you an article of clothing, often you would give them the materials. So the idea is, I'm hiring Nachri to make me a suit, and I'm going to give him the wool, the silk, the this, the that, and I measure it out beforehand. So the Gemara just says over here, as much as we said before, that you can go ahead and hire the kablan on Chol Hamoed for work after Chol Hamoed. What you can't do is start measuring out the materials on Chol Hamoed itself to give to him. So in other words, then what I can do is agree on the arrangement, lock in the arrangement, but anything else, actual work, as well as giving over of materials, has to be done after Yom Tiv. Tan Rabbanan. So we'll say more examples of things which cannot be done on Chol Hamoed. Ein marbiin behema b'chol shamoed. We'll say you can't mate animals on Chol Hamoed. Rashi says, Ein ochzin habehema umaviin ala zachar. So we'll say, so I guess in some species of animals, we're going to see is actually we'll see examples of this. Ultimately, again, you would bring the male to the female. So you can't actively go ahead and do that on Chol Hamoed. In Marbiin behema b'chol shamoed. Rabbi Huda says, chamora shetava. If you have a donkey, a chamora, right, the female donkey, that shetava, that wants to mate with the male, marbiin ala zachar. Ultimately, again, we bring the male, b'shvil shalot titztanein. So we'll say, so apparently by the female donkey, if she's ready to mate and she doesn't mate, it's going to be harder to mate with her later on. So therefore, again, we'll say, what does that represent? What does that represent? a davar ha'avid, and therefore it'll be mutar. Ushar kol behemos, other behemos, machnisin osel bekara. So we'll say other behemoths, what you just simply do is put them into the stable, they'll mate on their own. So apparently certain animals require human intervention or human help in order to go ahead and facilitate the mating process. Other animals will do it on their own. So again, you can't actively facilitate unless, of course, there's going to be a davar ha'avid, but you could put animals together recognizing that mating will occur on its own. Incredible. We'll say first wide line, Tanabanon. Ein medairin lo b'shavas u'sulamim tovim v'lo b'cholo shamoid v'im ba'u me'elehen mutar. So what's another interesting case? What's medairin? Look at Rashi. Machnisin behema lasada k'dei shiotziu zevel u'mezablan asada. So we'll say it's very interesting. I guess this is how they fertilized fields. You would bring your animals to a spot in the field. You would essentially put up like a temporary corral, right? Keep the animals in a particular area for a certain amount of time, and by definition, they fertilize the field, right? So again, I'm not actively spreading fertilizer. The animals are doing the work on their own. Both say, so that's the notion of medairin. Medairin means like dar, to live somewhere. You can't set up a corral, a temporary corral, on Shabbos, on Yom Tiv, or on Chol HaMoed to fertilize the field. But I will say, if the animals are kind of just walking around on their own, and as a result just of their own movement, they fertilize the field, then ultimately, again, mutter, it is permitted. Ve'in mesayin osan, ve'in mosrulan shomer lenar es sonam. So we'll say, now the Gemara is going on. The Gemara is saying, ve'in mesayin osam. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. Literally means you don't help them. What does that mean? Rashi says, lebehema lavo basada, o im nochrim hein, ein mesayin lahem la'asem imakom lamakom, so listen to this. So now, there are a couple of halachas happening over here. Halacha number one, you can't set up a corral for fertilization purposes on your field on Shabbos, Yom Tiv, Chol HaMoed. If the animals are doing this on their own, absolutely no problem. If there is a nachri who is moving the flock, you cannot assist him in anything to do with that in order to fertilize the field. Ve'in mosrin shomer lenares sonam. You can't go ahead and literally give over a worker. To go, Rashi says, lenaer lishmar kegonim nachrim heim. You can't hire someone to watch the flock. Let's say, again, if you have a Gentile shepherd. Haya sachir Shabbos, or I should say, haya schir Shabbos, schir chodesh, schir shana, schir shavua. But if the Nachri was hired for a week, was hired for a month, hired for a year, hired for 7 years, then Messiah knows some, then ultimately, again, it is permitted to go ahead and help them. Why? Messiah, Rashi says, Ki'ilu shal nachrimu. Because we'll say, interestingly enough, when it's a longer term hire, so the Nachri almost has the status of a kablon, right? And therefore, again, the flock is considered to be his, so to speak. He's managing his flock. Therefore, any assistance that I would give would be assistance to a Nachri and not considered to be assistance to myself. So the Gemara says, we'll say, again, we're not going to get into the halacha l'maisa with this because as you saw from Smichas Chaver, the halacha l'maisa by Amir l'Nachri is often much more complicated. But again, right now we'll just go through the sugya. Rabbi Omer, b'Shabbos b'tova, b'Yom Tiv b'Mizonos, b'Schar, I'm sorry, b'Moed b'Schar. So let's listen to this. Rabbi says, and this is very interesting, look at Rashi, b'Shabbos b'tova, imrotze shum adam l'seya la'osa sachir, b'tova sa'osa, k'nor b'china v'lo b'Schar. So Rabbi says like this, we'll say if the non-Jew is hired to go ahead and handle the flock, you could help him in the following way. For Shabbos, you could help him if it's just really what we call betova. Betova means that the most you'll get out of it is goodwill. On Yom Tiv, mizonos, if you're going to get food from it. On Chol HaMoed, if you could even do it in Meretz Hashem for payment. Rabbi Yosef says, Hilchasa Kirebi. That halacha follows Rabbi. Because so what you begin to see, what emerges from here, so just I think kind of the takeaways from here is as follows. Number one, that if the Nachri is a kablon and the Nachri is doing work for me, whether it's Shabbos, Yom Tiv, Chol HaMoed, the Nachri is permitted to do his work. As long as what? According to our Gemara over here, it's chutz l'tchum. And at least for Chalamayid, it would have to be really far away from any place where Jews are going to end up coming around. So I will say, in general, again, the halacha by kablanos is that you can go ahead and hire a nachri to be a you could contract with a nachri and Chalamayid as long as what? He doesn't start his work until when? After Chalamayid. But however, what you can't do is you can't start measuring out materials on Chalamayid itself. We begin to see that when it comes to managing one's livestock, so one is really precluded from engaging in real malacha, mating the animals, actively going ahead and fertilizing the field. But of course, if these things happen on their own, it's mutter. If there's a nachri managing the flock, so if it's a long-term arrangement with the nachri, he really takes on the status of a kablan, and therefore kind of incidental assistance by the Jew to the nachri will be permitted even on Chalamayid. Good. So we'll say again, like I said, the halacha is a bit more involved, but at least we have the parameters. Beautiful. It says the Mishnah. So we'll say, listen to this. So we'll say, listen to this. In the last Mishnah, we're speaking about olives. Right now we're speaking about what appears to be a similar case by grapes. So what's happened over here? I pressed my grapes. I pressed the grapes already. The wine is now in the vat. So we'll say, now what happened? So the wine is in we'll call it the pit, but it's in the vat. So the grapes have been pressed. The wine is in the vat. V'iru evel, and now chas v'shalom, the person becomes an avel. We'll call him Reuven, right? Reuven becomes an avel. O ones, or some other extenuating circumstance occurred. Good O ones, O shetu, or his workers never showed up. So I'll say, so remember again, let's point out, like we said in the last Mishnah, there's two different cases here, right? There's a case of avelos, which we really effectively dealt with in the previous sugya. You're not allowed to do work during avelos. So case number one is Reuven pressed his grapes. The wine is sitting in the vat. He becomes an avel. His avelos has nothing to do with Yom Tov, right? He's now just an avel. So the shaila just is, what is he permitted to do, not permitted to do during avelos? Case number two is he pressed his grapes. He was supposed to go ahead and put the wine into the barrels before Yom Tov. Either an extenuating circumstance occurred, there was a meis mitzvah, his workers never showed up to work, and now what happens? It's Yom Tov. It's Yom Tov, or really more appropriately, it's Chalamayid, and there's wine sitting in the vat. So what could he do? So the Gemara says, Zolei v'gomer v'gav kidarko div Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says, what's the halacha? The halacha is that he can go ahead and literally finish off the process. Zolei means he could pour the wine from the vat into the barrels. The gomer v'gav kidarko lesu, and go ahead and seal the barrels in the normal way. In other words, finish up the process. Finish up the process. Rabbi Yossi gives him the license to go ahead and finish normally. And again, I will say the idea over here is what Rabbi Yossi says. Why could he finish it up? Davra Avid. Very simple, Davra Avid. And Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that once it's a Davra Avid, you could finish, and you can finish normally. You need not employ a shinui. Rabbi Huda says, Oselo limudim b'shul shel liachnet. Rabbi Yossi says, no, here's what you could do. You could cover the vat with boards. Rabbi Huda says, we're not going to allow you to go ahead and transfer the contents of the cistern, right, or of the pit, of the vat into barrels. Instead, what we'll allow you to do is cover up the vat. If you cover up the vat with boards, that will effectively prevent spoilage. So we'll say Rabbi Huda is of the opinion that will allow you to go ahead and do something to stave off the loss, but you'll have to do it with a shinui. Says the Gemara, Utzricha, and I was saying that Avi's shaila is, this is the same case as the olives. Right, so why do I need both cases? To which Gemara I'll tell you why. The mishcha nafish pseida. Aval chamra de lo nafish pseida ema modei Rabbi Huda. So I'll say, I would have said like this. You see, if it would have just said the case of the olives, I would have said it's in the case of the olives that Rabbi Yossi really allows you to fully finish the process. Because Rabbi will say, if you don't press those olives, it's a total loss. It's a total loss. That's Rabbi Yossi allows you to go ahead and take action on Chalamayid. But by wine, the truth is, you could cover it with boards. And you'll be pretty much okay. I would have thought that in this case, maybe of the wine, Rabbi Yossi agrees with Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda, Yashmina Basraisa, if I would have just said this last case, Vahikam Rabbi Yehuda, this is, if I would have just said the wine case, it's the wine case Rabbi Yehuda says, all you could do is go ahead and cover it with boards. Ava Bahach, Ema Modi Lev Rabbi Yossi. But perhaps in the other case, i.e. the olive case, maybe Rabbi Yehuda agrees with Rabbi Yossi and allows you to really go ahead and fully press the olives. Therefore, tzricha. So we'll say, Salach Lamais, in both cases, I would not learn out one from the other. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba. Man tana shinui b'davar ha'avid. My tana, sorry. Man tana shinui b'moed b'davar ha'avid. But we'll say, who is the tana who holds that even with a davar ha'avid, you should employ a shinui? So to which the Gemara says, Delok Rabbi Yossi. It's clearly not like Rabbi Yossi. So in other words, we already mentioned this yesterday's daf, which is there's a fundamental machlokes. You see, everyone agrees that you're allowed to do malachan chalama'id for the sake of a davar ha'avid, to save a loss. What's the machlokes? Do you have to do a shinui with that malacha? In other words, are you permitted to do the malacha in the normal fashion, or do you somehow have to be meshana? Do you have to deviate? So Rabbi Yehuda says, yes, you have to use a shinui, as evidenced from the last two Mishnayos. Rabbi Yossi says you don't have to. Rabbi Yossi says once there is a davar ha'avid, you're permitted to do the malacha in the normative fashion. Rabbi Yossi said, halacha Rabbi Yossi. The halacha Rabbi Yossi will say that indeed is how we pass halacha l'maisa, that when there is a davar ha'avid, you don't have to do the malacha with the shinui, you could do the malacha in the normal fashion. On chalamad we're talking about, I will say. So it's an interesting case. Are you permitted to go ahead and seal a barrel of wine on chalamid? Rashi says lamesha logov hakavis. So we'll say here's I have a barrel of beer, not wine. I have a barrel of beer, right? The barrel has a crack. Obviously, if it has a crack, it means it's going to leak. So can I go ahead and seal the barrel on chalamid? Amar lahu Sinai. Amar halacha Rabbi Yossi. So he said to him, Sinai, which is Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef said that the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi, namely that when there is a davar ha'avid, you are permitted to go ahead and do malacha even without the shinui. Eimar dan Rabbi Yossi b'chamra. Maybe not. Maybe Rabbi Yossi only said by chamra, a barrel of wine that has a leak. A b'shichra mi amar. B'shichra mi amar. So I'll say, but who said he said it by beer? After all, chamra taimamai mishum denafish psida. But I don't say, why would you make a distinction? Rabbi Yossi allows you to seal a barrel of wine that has a leak. Why? Because it's going to represent a loss. Shechra nami ispe psida. But ultimately, again, beer, right? The barrel of beer that sprung a leak will also represent a loss. My mother said to me, Bar shis savi v'shaya, mi bar tamni v'lo shaya. So I'll say, look at Rashi just a moment. Klomar yafe shechar mugaf, shemachzik shisha sin, mi shechar shu b'kli gadol shemachzik shmona sin. So I'll say an interesting saying. My mother always told me, better to have a sealed 6 sa'ah barrel than to have a leaky 8 sa'ah barrel. Good life advice in general, we'll say, but also, so the idea over here is, what they're trying to highlight is that halacha l'maisa, that even a leak in a barrel of beer represents loss. So we'll say, by the way, also tells you something very interesting, that in life, especially in ruchnius, there's always this tension. Should I do more with lesser quality, or do less with greater quality? Should I have an 8 sa'ah barrel that's a little leaky, or a 6 sa'ah barrel that is totally sealed? Right? Do I say less is more? Right? Less is more. Do less, but do it better, or do more, but kind of a little bit leaky, right? A little bit. So I just want to point out that in the world of ruchnius, it's not always so clear. Right? It's not always so clear that by beer, apparently it's clear. By beer, apparently it's better to have a smaller barrel that doesn't have leaks. By ruchnius, so to point out that sometimes less is more, and sometimes it's better to remain a bit more focused and do less, but do it better. But sometimes there is a concept of just pushing myself to do more, even though I know it's not going to be great. Even though I know it's a shtickle leaky, right? I know that the barrel is not. I'll just point out different times in life kind of require different things. I think in the world, outside of ruchnius, very often, I remember, I will say, when I did a brief stint in public accounting, and I remember we had orientation, and the managing partner, who was obviously a very successful guy. This was one of the big six accounting firms back in the day. See, he the only thing I remember from orientation, it was a real chachma. He said, it's better to have one nice suit, one really nice suit, than it is to have 4 okay suits. He said, and better to wear that same suit every single day and look your best every single day than to be a little fashleptzach. He didn't use that word, but which I want to say was such a fascinating yisod. What he was saying is, better to be excellent at something, even if it's one thing, than to kind of be mediocre at a bunch of different stuff, which again is true in life. But again, I just want to point out that in Ruchnius, sometimes I just have to push myself forward, even if the barrel is a little bit leaky. Sometimes there's a time to do less and make sure that what I'm doing is really good, really solid. And sometimes there's just a yisod of being in an expansive mindset, and doing a lot and learning a lot and accomplishing a lot, even though I may not be retaining or holding on to everything that I'm doing. All right, the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, Amrav Char Bar Goria, Amrav, Hilchos Moed b'Moed, Kilchos Kusim. So we'll say this is actually very interesting. Kilchos Kusim b'Halacha. So the halachos of Chol Hamoed are like the halachos of Kusim in halacha. That was saying, I remember again, we spoke about the Kusim so many times, right? The Kusim, again, that nation, right, from Kusa, resettled in Eretz Yisrael by Shalmaneser, the king of Ashur. Not sure exactly what their status is, the full conversion, not full conversion. But for our purposes, what's the chap with Kusim? See, the thing about Kusim is whatever they do really well, right? Whatever they've taken upon themselves, they've really accepted upon themselves. So the Gemara says, it's very interesting, the halachos of Chol Hamoed are like the halachos of Kusim. What does that mean? Lemay hilchasa. So the Gemara says, what exactly does that mean? So the Gemara says, Amrav Daniel Bar Katino, Amrav Lomar Shena Kuros, Ve'im Lamedos Zumizu. So I will say, the same chap by Kusim is that what? By Kusim is some things they do, some things they don't do. Now I will say, is there a rhyme or reason for what Kusim do, what they don't do? Not really. It's kind of just some stuff they accepted, some stuff they didn't accept. So what the Gemara is saying is that by the halachos of Chol Hamoed, you can't necessarily learn out one halacha from the other. So you both say some frameworks of halacha are very intuitive. That once you know A, you can learn out B, you can learn out C, you can learn out D. Hilchos Chol Hamoed are a little bit. What's the word? I don't want to say inconsistent, but almost like, well, okay, we'll use inconsistent. Not inconsistent, but sometimes there's not a linkage between the halachas. So you can't necessarily go ahead and derive out one halacha from the other. And we're going to give examples like this. So the Gemara says, Shmuel, Zovsin Kusta, Vein Zovsin Chavisa. For example, you can go ahead, Zovsin Kufsa, you can go ahead and seal in a jug, but you can't seal a barrel. Vein Zovsin Chavisa, right? Seal it with pitch. So Rav Dimer Adamar, Zovsin Chavisa, Vein Zovsin Kusta. Other opinion says that you can go ahead and seal a barrel, but you can't seal a jug. So I'll say, what's the pshat? Mar chayish l'pseider, mar chayish l'tircha. So I'll say, interestingly enough, what's the issue? Because if we allow you to seal a pitcher, right, a jug, let's say, so again, that's able to save a loss, right? That's loss, taking care of loss, and not worrying about tircha. See, for example, sealing a barrel could save a loss, but also requires a lot more tircha, right? Sealing a pitcher is less tircha, but also again less loss. So the point we're just making over here is that the halachos don't always necessarily kind of form a pattern in which one could be easily extrapolated from the other. Amar Abaye Naktinon, Hilchos Moed Kilchos Shabbos. Rabbi says, in general, we look at the halachos of Chol Hamoed like the halachos of Shabbos. Amar Beis, Yesh mehen pater aval aser, veyesh mehen muter lechatchila. There are certain halachos of both sides that are pater aval aser, which means pater aval aser also means you're not allowed to do it. You're not allowed to do it. But if you did it, you're pater. You're pater. And then there are other things that ultimately, again, are aser lechatchila. Rav Huna chatztu lechatzta b'moada. So Rav Huna went ahead and Rav Huna had his field harvested on Chalamayid. Right? So I will say Chatzle Moed means he had his field harvested on Chalamayid. So says the Gemara, how could that occur? Esvei Rabba Rav Huna. So Esvei Rabba bar Rav Huna Rav Huna. Tochanin kemach b'moed l'tzorach hamoed v'shelo l'tzorach hamoed aser. So we'll say, what's the halacha? The halacha is that you're allowed to go ahead and grind up grain on Chalamayid for the sake of Chalamayid, right? But you can't grind grain that's not for the sake of Chalamayid. Davar sha'avad b'moed, mutar la'asosa b'moed. Similarly, again, I will say, something is going to be lost, right? If you're going to experience a loss, then you're allowed to perform that malacha on Chalamayid. So the Gemara says, davar she'eno avad b'moed, aser. But I will say, if a davar she'eno, something that's not a davar avid, can't be done on Chalamayid. So when is this true? B'tlushim in akarka. This is true when with things that are detached from the ground. So I will say, but ultimately, again, if something is attached to the ground, then even if there's going to be a total loss, you're not allowed to do the malacha. So I will say, this is a very interesting qualification. The Gemara is suggesting over here that when we speak about a davar avid, the ability to do malacha for a davar avid is something that is detached from the ground. But something that is attached to the ground, even if there's going to be a total loss, you can't do malacha. However, so we'll say, but an exception to this is follows. We'll say this is a new category of loss. This is what's called poel ve'ein lo mayochal, which means we'll say if you have a worker and the worker doesn't have what to eat. So we'll say this is fasting. So watch this case. Let's say there's a Jew. Once again, we'll call him Ruvain. Ruvain is a worker. He's a day laborer. Right now it's Chalamayid. So you can imagine for Chalamayid, day labor was a very slow time of year. So I will say, this is what's called the Paul Be'in Lo Mayochal. He's a worker. He has no money. He has nothing to eat. What's the halacha? Kotzer, uma'amer, vidash, vizore, uborer, vitochein, ubevach lo yadush bepara. So we'll say, listen to this. So we'll say, for a Paul Ein Lo Mayochal, you could allow him to do things which would otherwise be asa. So we'll say, what did we just say? We just said for that halacha l'maisa. For a davar avid, you're allowed to do malacha and chalamayid. But what's the cap? What's the limitation on davar amid? What's the cap? Muchaber l'karka. You can't go ahead and cut down anything that is attached to the ground. Meaning, so you can't go ahead and start harvesting fields on chalamayid if it's a davar avid. What's the exception to that rule? If it's a poal ve'in lo mayochal. If there's a Jewish worker and he has nothing to eat, what you could do is you could hire him to go ahead and harvest the field. You could hire him to harvest the field. So we'll say you could hire him to do something that would normally not be allowed. Now, what's the logic behind that? Because I'm providing him with a parnasa. The only cap that he has is he can't start threshing a field with a team of oxen. So we'll say, listen to this. So what's amazing about this? I'll just point out, you'll think to yourself, 1 second, if he's a poor va'in lo mayochal, there's an easier solution. What's the easier solution? Right? Give him food, right? So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that the ability to give someone work and the ability to go in and give someone an honest day's living is so much better than giving him a handout. So we'll say, and even if it means allowing him to do something that the truth is we don't normally do in Chalamayid, right? We don't harvest fields on Chalamayid, but we will harvest fields if it means allowing someone to earn an honest wage, so much better than giving them tzedakah. It's not that we don't have the money. He'll say it's about, again, what's for the benefit of this individual. Paul ve'in lo mayochal, so much better for him on so many levels, for him to have an honest day's work than to have to receive tzedakah. Amar lei, he said to him, Yechidahi. This is a singular opinion, v'lo svira lan kavase, but we do not hold like this. Tisanya, klal amar Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said, I will say, first wide line, mishum Rabbi Yossi, davar hatalush min hakarka, afilu miktsasa avud mutter. So I will say something that is detached from the ground, even if there's going to be a partial loss. Ultimately, again, malacha with this item becomes mutter. But if something is attached to the ground, Afido kulo avid aser. So we'll say, listen to this. So this is a fundamental machlokes, we'll say, about what are you allowed to do with something that is mechuber lekarka, right? So again, we'll say you have produce that's attached to the ground. What are your options in terms of this produce? So here we'll say this brisa quotes an opinion that says, even if you're going to suffer a total loss, if it's mechuber lekarka, you can't do anything with it on Chalamayid. Avi Rabbi Yossi, but I will say 1 second. So let's go back for just a moment. So we'll say, so you have over here, remember how this whole thing started. Rav Huna allowed for his field to be harvested on Chalamayid. Now that must have been a case where it was a davar ha'avid. It was a davar ha'avid. Then I will say, so what you begin to see is that halacha lamaisa. So again, there's a machlokes about what you could do with mechuber lekarka by a davar ha'avid. Do you have a license to go to work with mechuber by a davar ha'avid, or do we say no? Davar ha'avid only applies to detached items, not to attached items. So this is a fundamental machlokes. So it says Rabbi Yossi. Now I will say the truth is, let's go back for just a moment. Remember, what did Rabbi Yossi say? Rabbi Yossi said that halacha lamaisa, when it comes to a davar ha'avid, you don't need what? You don't need a shinui. Right? That's what Rabbi Huda. You don't need a shinui. Rabbi Yossi, yadosh nami beparos. According to Rabbi Yossi, you should even be able to plow with a team of oxen. In other words, you shouldn't require any kind of shinui. Ham Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba, man tana shinui b'moed b'davar ha'avid. But say, who's the one who says that you need a shinui when it comes to a davar ha'avid? Delok Rabbi Yossi. It's not like Rabbi Yossi. In other words, we're saying Rabbi Yossi does not require a shinui b'davar ha'avid. Amar lecha hachinami kevan dechol yom alav b'paros daishi ha'idna nami lav shinuihu. Rabbi Yossi will see something different. Rabbi will say that in general, people don't necessarily plow every day with oxen, right? In other words, you can plow without oxen also. So since it's not used every day, Rabbi Yossi would not say that it would be called a shinui not to use oxen. Okay, Tan Rabbanan. So therefore, I will say, again, I just want to point out over here, this introduced us now. So continuing in the halachos of davar ha'avid. So just remember, I will say the things to keep in mind. So davar ha'avid, I know I'm allowed to do malacha and chalamayid. What we're now beginning to see, I will say, is that doesn't allow for every single malacha. So the shaila is specifically, what do I do with mechuber lekarka? What can I do with produce that is attached to the ground? If there's going to be a loss, do I have the right to harvest? Do I have the right to work the field? That is a machlokes. That is a machlokes. Again, we'll see that halacha l'maisa in tomorrow's daf, not today. We'll get to that. But I will say that's number one. Number two, we're now introduced to a brand new category of davar ha'avid, a different kind of davar ha'avid. What's the new kind of davar ha'avid? Poel ve'ein lo ma yochal. A worker who has nothing to eat. So we begin to see Abba say that I'm allowed to give him work. And what kind of work am I allowed to give him? What kind of work? Even the kind of work that it appears I would be prohibited to do on my own. So something that I could not do as a regular individual, I could give to the Poel ve'ein lo ma yochal. Quite incredible. So turn around, Barnabas, so let's go. So just keep this all in mind. Now, the parameters of that, what I can give him, how I can give, we have to see. So turn around, Barnabas, tochnin b'moed l'tzarech hamoed. You can go ahead and grind, right? Grind grain, for example, on chalamayid for the purpose of the moed. So we'll say, so again, let's say I have wheat. I can make that wheat into flour on chalamayid, assuming that's what? I need the flour for chalamayid. But if it's not for chalamayid, I can't do it. Then I will say, now remember, if I ground grain, right? I ground grain, and now I have extra flour for after chalamayid, that's mutter. In other words, we'll say, the idea over here is just, I can only grind if I need it for chalamayid. But if it turns out that I grind and I have extra, that's fine. Harei mutter. Coats it's in eitzin b'moed l'tzarech hamoed. So I will say, I can cut down branches on chalamayid for purpose of chalamayid. We'll say, so again, let's say I need fire, I need wood for my stove. So I could go ahead and cut down branches for wood for my stove. What I can start doing, I will say, is what? I can start cutting down wood for non-chalamayid purposes. Now, I will say, if I cut down branches for use on chalamayid, and what? It turns out I have extra, fine. You can make beer on chalamayid for the purpose of chalamayid. But I will say, I can't make beer for post-chalamayid use. But I will say, but halacha l'maisa, if I made beer and what? If I made beer and there's leftover, it's mutter. Here's the qualification for all of these cases. Ubilvad shelo yarim. And I will say, what you can't do is, you can't be disingenuous. So I will say, if I know that for chalamayid, I need 1 barrel of beer, but I make 4 barrels of beer. And I say, oh, I thought I was going to use it. What do you know? What do you know? What do you know? I have leftovers. So I will say, that's harama, right? Subterfuge, right? That's harama. That you can't do. So the Gemara, so what the Gemara is saying is like this. Anything you need for chalamayid, you could do. When I say chalamayid, it also means chalamayid / yamtiv. So I need flour, grind the flour. You need branches for your oven, get branches for the oven. You need beer, make beer. But Allah chalamaisa, and if you have leftover, that's okay, as long as what you did makes let's say differently, as long as the volume of the malacha makes sense for chalamayid / yamtiv needs. But if the volume for the malacha clearly indicates that you're doing this for post yamtiv use, that's going to be aser. So Gemara says, Raminhu will raise a kasha to this. Matilin sheikh ramoy tzarach hamoy. You can make beer and chalamayid for the purpose of yamtiv. V'shlo tzarach hamoy aser. Echad sheikh tomorrow, ve'echad sheikh saorim. So you can make beer, whatever beer you want, as long as you make it for chalamayid. Date beer, wheat beer, barley beer. V'afa pishi yeshlo yashan. This is true even if you have old beer. But let's say you want fresh beer, right? For chalamayid, for yamtiv, you're allowed to. So marim v'shosem min achadash. Now we'll say, now this price is pretty crazy. This price says even if you have old beer, but you want new beer. Not only that, we'll say, what do you really want? You really want beer for after yamtiv. You want beer for after yamtiv. But again, what you're going to do, Abbas, you know what you're going to do? You're going to make a new batch of beer, and what? You'll drink some of it. You'll drink, so we'll say that's harama. Right, that's subterfuge. So really, you don't need beer. You have plenty of beer, but you want beer for after yamtiv. So what you're going to do is you're going to make new beer on chalamayid, drink some of it. I don't really need to drink some of it, but my goal is to have it for after yamtiv. Ultimately, again, the price seems to indicate that that's mutter, that you could do it. As long as you actively partake of some of the new beer, you're good to go. So I'll say, so again, this price seems to indicate that harama, this type of subterfuge, is permitted. So Tanaihi, in reality, it's machlokes Tanaim. This sanyo, in ma'arimin bekach. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ma'arimin. So I'll say it's a fundamental machlokes as to Allah chalamaisa is harama. Is this type of subterfuge permitted? I will say, so essentially the machlokes is like this. We'll just take the beer example. Can I go ahead and make new beer and chalamayid, knowing full well that I have old beer, and really I'm just going to drink a little bit of the new beer to justify its creation, but in fact I'm really using it for after yamtiv. So again, imachlokes tanoim as to whether or not such a situation like that is mutter. We'll see the halacha lemaisa. Rav chatz tulei chatzda. So we'll say Rav had his field harvested on b'chol demoed. So we'll say, so again, obviously it doesn't mean that Rav did it himself. It means that Rav had workers who did it. Shama Shmuel ikbid. Shmuel heard about this and he became very upset. Right, Rav, how can you go ahead and have your field harvested on chalamayid? You're working on mechubar lekarka. How could that be? So the Gemara says, Leima Shmuel ki. So maybe Shmuel. So it must have been that Shmuel holds like the opinion that harvesting the field is problematic. And I was about to say it must have been. Let's play this out. Why did Rav have the field harvested? Why did he do this? It must have been that what? Right, Davara Avid. Right? Or maybe Paul Be'ilama Yochal. It must be one of those. So Shmuel obviously holds like the opinion that says, no, you can't do anything with Mechaber Lekarka. So the Gemara says, Shmuel Kechidas Virale, Lo Chatzda Dechiti Hava. It was the harvesting of wheat. To Lo Hava Pasid. Ultimately, again, I will say the reason why Rav got upset was because it wasn't a Davara Avid. Right? So, I'm sorry, Shmuel got upset. So he doesn't understand why Rav allowed for the harvesting of a wheat field. I will say, apparently wheat doesn't go bad if you leave it in the ground a little bit longer. So Shmuel felt Rav could have easily waited till after Yom Tov to do this. Why did he have to do it now? The Rav, my time of Avatachi, why did Rav do this? Ein lo ma yochal hava. Oh, I will say, because what was the case? The case was a Paul ve'ein lo ma yochal. Right? You're right. Rav didn't need to harvest the field, but Rav knew as a Jew who didn't have parnasa. He didn't have anything to eat over chalamayit. He allowed him, paid him to harvest the field, because again, that's the halacha. So I will say, why did Shmuel have such a problem with this? Ushmuel lo haiba saimua kamei. I will say, so how often happens in life? Shmuel didn't know the whole story. He didn't know the whole story. So he got upset because all he saw was that Rav had his field harvested on Chalamayid, and he did not know the secret. I'll say, how many times in life does it happen that we get upset, right? Because we don't know the whole story, or we pass judgment because we don't know the whole story. Inami Adam Chashush. We keep coming back to this. The other possibility is that no, Shmuel knew the whole story, but he still felt that Rav, as an Adam Chashuv, should not have done this. See, I both say, Shmuel might know the whole story, but remember again, the common man does not know the whole story. All the common man sees is what? Rav's field was harvested, Rav's great wheat field was harvested on Chalamayid. So Shmuel felt a high-profile person like Rav should not do this. Okay, good. Rabbi Yehuda Nesiya, Nafik b'chumarta demedusha, v'ashti mai da'achim kfela arma. Rabbi Yehuda Nesiya went out on Shabbos b'chomarta demedusha. I will say chomarta demedusha. Rashi says it's tabas hi shalmatachas v'chosma shalamag. It is a metal ring that has a wooden seal. It's a signet ring. Furthermore, Rabbi Yehuda Nesiya also drank water that was heated up by a non-Jew. Rabbi Avi heard this and he was very upset. He felt Rabbi Yehuda Nesiya did the wrong thing. But in both cases, I'm Rav Yosef, my time maker, why did he get upset? If it's because of a signet ring, a person should, we learned this in Masechah Shabbos, a person should not wear a signet. Normally a ring is a tachshit, right? There's an ornament. And again, a piece of jewelry becomes like an article of clothing. Signet rings are different and should not be worn on Shabbos. So I will say, even though you shouldn't perhaps go ahead and wear a signet ring out, but halacha l'maisa, again, it's not muktzah. So okay, maybe he didn't agree with Rabbi Yehuda going ahead and wearing the signet ring, but l'maisa it's not muktzah. If he was upset that he drank water that was heated up by a non-Jew, so we'll say, what's the problem with drinking water that was heated up by a non-Jew? Bishalakum. So we'll say it's not bishalakum. Why? So we'll say ultimately again, anything that can be consumed raw is not an issue of bishalakum. We'll say this is how you're allowed to buy coffee, right? How can you allowed to buy coffee, right, in a non-Jewish establishment, right? Ultimately again, because it's not bishalakum, because anything that could be water is not subject to bishalakum. Also other reasons, because it's not a machal chashub. In any event, the idea over here is, so we'll say, why was who got upset here? I'm sorry. Rabbi Ami. Why was Rabbi Ami getting upset? Adam chashuv shayni. Ultimately, once again, because he felt Rabbi Yehuda should have held himself to a different standard, because an Adam chashuv is different. Good. Amrav Chanana Amarav. Code states Adam deka b'moed af b'shen tzarich el l'nesar shalo. So let's listen to this. Rav Chanan, also the name of Rav, a person could cut down a palm tree on Chalamayid, even though he only needs the sawdust. So we'll say, let's say I need sawdust on Chalamayid, right? For whatever the reason. I need sawdust for some permitted Yom Tov purpose. I could cut down a palm tree in order to get the sawdust. Now we'll say, Layit ale Abaye. Abaye cursed a person who would do such a thing. So we'll say, what does that mean? Abaye cursed, that's pretty strong. Abaye felt that's too much malacha for very little benefit. In other words, to engage in the entire process of cutting down a palm tree just to get the sawdust, ultimately, again, it's too much malacha. So the Gemara tells an incredible story. Rav Ashi Havale Abba Bashlaina. We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up Emirat Hashem with this story tomorrow. An incredible story, but I will say, so again, we end off with this idea of Abaye saying you can't do too much malacha if the result or the benefit is going to be limited in nature. This time, Mr. Torah, so I say, Shkayach. Packed off today. Shkayach, everyone.